This is Cybersound, your simplified and fundamentals-focused source for all things cybersecurity, with your hosts, Jason Pufall and Stephen Maresca.
Welcome to Cybersound. I'm your host, Jason Pufall, and as always, joined by Steve Maresca. Hey, Steve.
Hey.
So I think we both agree that today's podcast has the potential to be pretty rambling. We're going to talk about the evolution of cyber attacks, sort of the evolution from, call it then. Then could be as far back as 1970 to now. Kind of walking through a little bit, you know, what the history of viruses, malware, attack intentions were, things like that. I know that you have some thoughts on how you want to start it. So, why don't we kick it off right there with a little bit of I guess we call it a malware timeline, a virus timeline?
Sure. So I've been accused of having a bit of a computer museum or graveyard in general. I like old things. History matters.
I thought a museum.
Museum, yeah, that's better. History matters. And, everything that's old is new again, and that's especially true in technology. I think that, the important thing to know is that while cultural awareness of the population at large of computer viruses and malware and things like that began maybe in the early 90s, maybe with some films at the time, maybe as early as, mid 80s with, what's that Matthew Broderick movie?
That should roll off. That should roll off, right?
So I'm losing points here.
I'll think of it. Yeah, you threw me one I wasn't prepared for.
No, this is important. War Game?
War Games.
Yeah.
There you go, Matthew Broderick. That's shameful. If everybody listening to this is like, how do they not know War Games immediately?
So popular cultural awareness of things like viruses in general really started in the early 90s, and maybe as far back as mid-80s with War Games and other movies like Hackers. But the truth is that it goes back a lot further than that, and especially in academia, where computers really had their first foray out into the real world. And to a lesser degree, certainly in military and similar. At the beginning, viruses and malware were really just tricks played on colleagues. They were little toys. They didn't really do anything. They were just sort of curiosities. They would do things like rename files or hide them on people. Silly little things of that sort. And I'm not going to mention anything particular. It doesn't matter. Over time, it moved to inconvenience. Tying up a computer so that others couldn't use it. It's not really malicious. It's just sort of an irritant.
So kind of an early denial of service.
Yeah,
in a sense.
Before those terms were even invented, right? Thereafter, it was more of a pursuit of notoriety, especially in the late 80s, early 90s. The specific example that some people might want to go out and take a peek at is the Morris worm. It's something related to, mass propagation of across systems. Bottom line, it and things like it had to do with notoriety and awareness in the other areas of computing. They were really to make your name known by others. So, people would create such things to stake a claim, to make noise, to develop a reputation.
So a technical claim, to demonstrating technical prowess?
Prowess,
okay.
Yeah. Prestige in the technical realm of, civil disobedience or something to that effect.
Right. But so we really haven't yet then entered in your timeline what we'll call the real malice in a lot of ways. Right. So we talked a little bit about, hey, you're experimenting in the computer world, you've done some stuff that probably manifests itself as inconvenient. Maybe you're demonstrating that you actually have expertise, but we haven't entered probably what I would describe as a disruptive phase.
No, yeah, definitely not.
Okay.
So I would say that really began in earnest in the 90s, with some earlier examples that aren't super important. But the goal at the time was to encrypt a floppy so that you couldn't use it because the owner decided that you were using their software inappropriately, or things of that sort. Propagation that would harm systems to make them unusable, or turn documents into gibberish.
Right.
Those were the early early attacks in the 90s.
So is it fair to say, though, and I'm going to throw out a term that you may or may not have thought about getting to yet, the idea of sort of hacktivism, right, where people had maybe a political or a politically motivated agenda or a social agenda of some sort.
Hack the Planet in Hackers, the movie.
I mean, that's what it was, right? And I
Absolutely.
think there was a period of time where, DMCA, the Copyright Infringement Act, right, some of the viruses, if I recall, would go through and rename or delete MP3s.
Right,
and,
absolutely.
Music stolen or pirated music. So, there was definitely activities around, if you want to call it this, you can call it the social good, right? Where people actually had an agenda and they were trying to exercise what they believed to be their right to do the right thing.
Right. Information wants to be free is a common phrase used in that realm. And it's true. It was the goal of many early hacktivists before that was a real term of art that people threw around to, expose information, to publicize stuff that was secret, to make things like copyrighted music available for all. To make expensive things available to those without means. Those were really, some of the early efforts of malware and viruses. Now, were things occurring at the same time that were legitimately malicious? Absolutely. But they were more narrow.
Yeah.
We're talking in the realm of industrial espionage, nation-state warfare, that sort of thing. And then everyone suddenly had computers everywhere. Right. The late 90s really made the breadth of available systems on the internet at large and it's companies in general worth attacking for motives other than pure public amusement.
All right. So on your timeline now, we'll say we're entering the modern age.
Yeah.
To a degree.
Right.
Late 90s?
No, it's certainly late 90s, but I think that everyone that really has a memory of this time in terms of inconvenience might remember the early worms, 2000, 2003, that time frame when computer systems that were on the network without firewalls, exposed to the internet, could be brought down in an afternoon across the entire planet because of some sort of a vulnerability. And that's when true capability to disrupt and true capability to cause harm actually really were manifest.
So maybe just for posterity's sake, we'll throw out a couple of some of the big names, right? The big guns back there in the late 90s. Certainly, the Melissa worm was one that I feel like anybody who's maybe 40 or more might remember. The I love you virus, I think, was a really interesting one. Because I think it so clearly took advantage of the people aspect of this, encouraging people to click on attachments. Who doesn't want love, I suppose. But that's what it was, right? You
right, it affected millions of systems.
Real transition to that social engineering and encouraging the population to essentially be part of your attack, right? And that might not be the first one. I think it's probably very recognizable.
Right. Other examples were like the Anacornakova virus, which spread via email and sent using all the contacts that you had in your inbox. And that's when we talk about true legal action being taken against some of the creators. That specific example resulted, I believe, in either community service or jail time. That's when we're in a different realm where it's criminalized. We have actual laws on the books that are taking action against such activity. And it's, I wouldn't say the inflection point, but certainly around the time where criminal elements started to use these techniques and these tools to affect businesses, to acquire data, to impact or otherwise stop business from occurring.
But still not really heavily targeted, right? So when you talk about a virus that would utilize your address book to basically propagate, right, to send itself out, not hugely targeted. You don't really know who you're getting, so it's very opportunistic.
Broad net, drive-by type attacks, absolutely.
Right. So disruptive for sure, but not where we are today, right?
Right. Exactly. And I would say that was largely the case for a few more years. The blaster worm was something that might be recalled. It had to do with, Windows vulnerability at the time, and also spread internationally very quickly.
Yeah, and Windows got a real bad rap through all this, for sure, right? As being that platform that everybody was exploiting, and without fairly accounting for the fact that it probably was 90% of the computing base at the time. But
I would say this time frame is when antivirus was generally accepted to be a required tool to protect systems. Certainly, Norton was around for the better part of 15 or 20 years at that time frame, so it wasn't new, but everyone meaning lay people at home with new computers who were helping their kids do homework. That's when everyone was affected.
Right. Well, and you're hugely reliant on a tool like Norton. I mean, I can remember being in scenarios where Blaster or one of these things came out, and the conversation among the IT people was, is there a definition for it, right? Or is there a way to get a definition for it? So you're really reliant on those tools to detect and hopefully clean. I think it more likely they could clean it sort of back then than some of the things you see now.
But you're getting into the cat and mouse game of this entire reality. Those tools are driven by known issues, and if they don't encounter it, they don't know how to protect against it, to find it, to clean up after it. And today that's not the case. We use tools that are behaviorally oriented, that detect anomalies that aren't encountered before. But in the bad old days, that was not the case, and it certainly took a great amount of time to get the proper data and visibility into systems to improve those tools. So it took a long time.
So we talked a little bit, right, in the timeline. There is we'll call it the benign phase. I'm breaking these up into eras. The benign phase, maybe the hacktivism phase to some degree.
And they're parallel threads. They're not necessarily sequential.
For sure, yeah. But in the evolution of this, and then we probably talked a hair about disruption. But I think, I feel like we're really we've moved past disruption nowadays. And much more into the extortion side of things, right? The theft and extortion side.
And I'd say that was the tail end of the 2000s when we really started to see that shift. Obviously, there were many examples prior to that with, individual companies being held ransom or had demands placed upon them because of some attack via virus. But the truth is that the shift to what we now call ransomware maybe began in the late 2000s. At the end of the day, it's a question of profit motive. It's a question of this entire realm shifting towards money. And prior to the better part of the period we're talking about prior to it, it was political messaging. It was making a statement or just seeing what would happen, curiosity of the malicious sort. I think that extortion in general, especially today with ransomware, is the goal. And if not, simply destroying a perceived enemy of the people or an enemy of a state or you name it. That's what happens. I mean, we could use Stuxnet, the more industrial espionage type issues. We've made reference to that in the supply chain stuff that we talked about a couple episodes ago. It's an element in this overall timeline, but it's sort of it's a cul-de-sac. It's a parallel path, and it certainly doesn't affect everybody.
But we certainly see much more targeted or focused attacks. No question about that.
There's forethought in the attacker's approach.
Well, and I think we've spoken a little bit about it being, a business, right? That office environment with structure to the attacks, thought behind who they want to attack, thought about the data or the outcome, right? What strikes me though through this is, in 10 minutes here we walked through 50 years of the virus history pretty quickly. There's certainly elements though of the attacks that are largely the same, right? So I think they all leverage or focus on people, right? There's this huge social engineering quality to some of the first attacks, right? We talked about I love you as sort of that social engineering piece. There's examples of it way before that. Email remains a really successful delivery mechanism for these. Maybe the payload's a little bit different, right? But the idea of enticing somebody to take action on your behalf remains really effective.
At the beginnings, people were the creators of these tools. They were doing so for fun or, reputational reasons. They shifted to using cut that part, but people being the common thread ultimately because they were the creators to begin with, but then they became the targets themselves. Email, phishing, those are the example. The reason for it is simple. Defensive tools became better, systems are better protected, but the common thread between everything is the fact that people, their behavior, their perception of threat is vulnerable, and no technology can really protect against that.
And they know that. I mean, there's no question about it that even with good training, even with good technology in place, the opportunity exists for these to be really successful for the foreseeable future.
You don't need a piece of malware if someone willingly gives up their password and allows you to impersonate them. And
that's what did we read earlier? I think 20 to 25% of security incidents originate as a result of just credential theft, right? Whether that is somebody providing credentials or maybe a little more of a technical technique, but
yeah, 20% of all breaches are
right.
Initiated in some sort of credential release. 80% themselves being associated with identity theft. They're sobering numbers.
Yeah, and I don't even know I don't know there's any likelihood of that improving in the near term.
As technologies improve and detection methods improve as well, the only thing left are people. And therefore, that's the shift of all of these attacks. And that will remain the case no matter how good these technologies become.
The interesting part, I think, is that transition from experimental to intentional. And I think that is something I feel like I really personally want to drive home, which is, we have conversations all the time and people feel like it's unlikely that they individually or they as their business would be victims of these types of attacks. When in reality, the motivation is different than it used to be. And financial is a big component of it. Certainly, there's some social components to it potentially as well. But I think everybody represents an opportunity at this point. There's a lot of money in this kind of hacking, right? I don't love that term necessarily, but there's a lot of money there. And I think as long as there's a lot of money and people are paying ransoms or people aren't doing the appropriate things proactively, we're going to see this stuff exist.
Yeah, absolutely. It's never ending ultimately.
Anything you wanted to end with? I think we could spend a lot of time on the history of this stuff.
Yeah, it's really complex territory. I mean, the people who are creating viruses in the early 90s today are often finding bugs as opposed to creating malware.
Right.
And just like anything else, there's a double-edged sword to it. The WannaCry ransomware kill switch, it was triggered by one of those researchers because he recognized a bug in that ransomware and used it against it to liberate many PCs from that infection. Is that ethical? Is it beneficial? These are debatable things.
Right.
And without a doubt, a lot of suffering and potential harm was saved by using that framework to stop the propagation of the platform. But, the skills, the people involved, again, returning to people being the common thread, the people need to be there. And if their efforts are redirected towards good, we'll be better off.
So I think, so that's a nice way to end, right? It's always nice to end positively. And I think that idea that there is an outlet for those who have the intellectual curiosity to explore how things work and where the vulnerabilities might be. Bug bounties exist.
Right.
Companies pay talented people to identify weaknesses so they can fix them.
I know several people who make their living doing that.
Yeah, and so that's one way. And even if you do it simply as nothing more than an intellectual exercise, most companies appreciate if you let them know. You don't want to do the opposite of that and just make them public without giving a company an opportunity to fix a mistake that they had.
Responsible disclosure of vulnerabilities in general, that's that's a subject for another day, and I
Sure
think we
is.
should discuss it actually because it impacts how we triage issues. But without a doubt, that's important as well.
So so maybe a future episode on responsible disclosure. I think that actually is not a bad idea at all. But with that, I think we spent a little bit of time. But we covered 50 years in 15 minutes. If anybody does want to hear maybe some more information or sort of explore some of this stuff in more depth, maybe let us know. We're always happy for input or suggestions. Reach out at Vancord Security on Twitter, and we'll incorporate comments or questions if we can. But with that, as always, thanks for listening, and we hope you got some value out of this.
Stay vigilant. Stay resilient. This has been Cyber Sound.